Ash, in honor of you, I'm wearing my embeddings shirt.
Oh, I love that
Uh,
shirt.
Yeah, my embeddings shirt is, and we're going to relate the embeddings shirt to the thing around my neck. That's what this talk is going to be about. The thing around
Oh,
my neck
cool.
is this polytope. So yeah, like this is like the seventh or eighth in a series of lectures I've been giving on high dimensional geometry and embeddings. And it was Jesse actually who suggested on Twitter, I think, that we should record them, put them up on YouTube. So I'm going to record this and see how it goes and maybe put it up on YouTube. I don't know, but at least it'll be available for other planet people who can't make this particular schedule. So we're going to talk about neural collapse, which is a kind of new thing. That's a pretty interesting new insight into what's going on in a lot of deep learning systems. And we're going to first talk about the terminal phase of training, which has been known for a while, also known as double descent. And then that kind of prompted some investigations which led to the discovery of this phenomenon of neural collapse, which in order to really understand neural collapse, you have to understand a bunch of things. But one thing you have to understand is simplexes, of which they sort of renamed to be equiangular tight frames in the context of neural collapse. It's really just simplexes. And then we're going to talk about catastrophic forgetting briefly, which is I'm not going to go over it right now, and how you can sort of route around catastrophic forgetting if you have an understanding of neural collapse, and you can then also solve problems with how can I say this? A lot of this is done in terms of classifiers because they're easy to think about. They're not. This isn't just relevant to classifiers, but since classifiers are so well studied and well understood, and you can make really simple ones, a lot of this analysis is done in terms of classifiers. And one of the problems with classifiers is, of course, if you show it stuff that's in a new class all of a sudden, like what happens? Does it forget all the information about the old classes when you start training it with some new classes? Or what if the classes are highly unbalanced? So we're going to talk about that in the context of neural collapse. And then we're going to talk about neural collapse when you don't have enough dimensions in your space to have each class kind of mapped into one dimension, which gets us into this optimal spherical codes thing, which I've talked about before in previous lectures, which is kind of an obsession of mine because optimal spherical codes they show up everywhere in physics and engineering and information theory and now deep learning. Although this is very new, there's only one or two papers that talk about optimal spherical collapse and, optimal spherical codes and how it relates to neural collapse. People are starting to catch on. I thought I was the only one who saw this, but apparently other people have seen it actually published. And then we're going to talk about, is neural collapse actually a good thing in all circumstances? Like, do we even want these neurons to be quote unquote collapsed, which relates also to the Matryoshka um, learning, which we talked about in a previous one. And then we're going to look at neural collapse deeper into the network and discuss sort of what the additional layers do as you add additional layers to a network and what's going on in the hidden layers, because this gives insight into that. This is a very powerful technique and way to understand what is actually going on inside we call it a black box in these deep nets, but it's funny, they're not really black boxes at all. I mean, we can peer into any layer and look at anything we want without disturbing the system. It's not like a human brain where we don't have that luxury. And then we're going to end with a discussion of kind of a thing that goes even beyond neural collapse, but does incorporate it, which whether they know it or not, which is called the Platonic representation hypothesis. So getting right into it, neural collapse was first mentioned in 2020 in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It's kind of rare that journal, which is one of the top journals in the world in general science, will publish a deep learning paper. But they did publish this, and hats off to them because they understood the importance. And if you search for a neural collapse on Google Scholar, unlike almost anything else in deep learning, you only get a few hundred hits. You don't get like 10,000. So it's kind of a new thing. It was first elucidated in 2020. And but before neural collapse came along, there was a bit of a paradox. which neural collapse helps explain. And that's this thing which has got two names. It's called the double descent phenomenon or the terminal phase of training. They're not exactly the same, but they're related. So as we all know, let's look at the left-hand side of this chart. We all know if we train a network, say a classifier, and we keep training it, this is epochs on the x-axis. They call it iterations. We might notice epochs. As we keep training, the loss function goes down as we continue to train, and the training error goes down as we continue to train. And if the network has enough parameters, if it's over parameterized, there's way more parameters than there are, say, classes that we're trying to classify, then we can drive the training error to zero, where it always classifies the entire training data set, every example correctly, because it's just memorized the training. And we tend to think of that, though, as involving overfittings, because if we look at the out-of-sample test data performance of such a network, as you know, we find that it gets better and better, and then eventually it turns around and it starts to get worse and worse, which is where we see this curve, green curve, go up. And that we say, oh, we're in the overfitting regime, and yes, it's memorizing the training data, but it's suffering on the test data. But the interesting thing to note is that the loss functions of these networks in general are not the same as the classification accuracy. So you can continue to train these networks, again, just feeding it the training data over and over and over again, and you can continue to drive the loss function down even after it has memorized the training data and the classification error, say for a classifier, is already zero and can't go lower. So what happens if you keep training it on the training data and driving the loss function by tweaking the weights and backprop and all this stuff, we keep driving the loss function down. It turns out the test error rate turns around and it starts decreasing again. This is why it's called double descent, because it descends at the beginning, then it ascends, and then it starts descending again. Now, this is very strange because if we were just overfitting, you'd think, why would the out-of-sample test error start to get lower and lower as we continue training on the training data and adjusting the weights to drive down the loss function, even though we've already memorized and have zero training error? How would the test error go down? So this was a mystery. People loved it because it meant that they trained for tons and tons of epochs. They got good generalization performance, but nobody really knew why. Then this paper came out in 2020 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and I'm just going to ask you to take 30 seconds to read this right-hand yellow block. I'm not going to read it out loud. So they do this, they examine this double descent on many different networks, many different data sets, and what they noticed was something peculiar was going on. And I want to also draw your attention to the red block of text here, which is not only does the network converge to a rigid structure, that's neural collapse, we'll talk about what that means, but it occurs simultaneously with improvements in the network's generalization performance as well as its robustness against adversarial examples. So this is a very powerful thing and counterintuitive. You continue to quote unquote overfit, and your network gets better and better at classifying out of sample data. And it's another way of saying what is generalization. We'll get back to that. It gets better and better to being robust against adversarial examples. Mikkel, you have a question?
Yeah, maybe I'm missing something. I'm a little bit tired today, but how can we have absolute perfect classification on the training set and still have a non-zero cross entropy loss?
You don't, first of all, you don't have to be training with cross entropy loss. You can train with other loss functions. This is a fairly universal phenomenon. And so like if you're training with a triplet loss or something like that, you know.
The bit of text that you highlighted on the right on the screen says driving the cross entropy loss to zero long after the classification error is already zero.
Right. Okay. I don't That's a good question, but I'm sure the answer is well understood. It's if you
Yeah.
look at the details of the cross entropy loss, I think that has to do with real numbers rather than just is it getting the correct class.
Okay. Yeah. It must be something like that.
I mean, because the correct class is done usually with softmax, right? Whereas the cross entropy loss is done using the actual activations of the penultimate
True. Okay.
layer. So that's probably what's going on. Okay. So now, this terminal phase, this is from that 2020 paper. The terminal, oh no, this is not. This is paraphrasing the 2020 paper. They basically talked about this neural collapse and they broke it into four different things. One is that during the terminal phase of training, when this out of sample error keeps getting lower and the loss keeps getting lower, even though the training error is zero, the within class, we're gonna show this stuff graphically. But what happens is, first of all, the within class activations in the training data differences because of the activations of the within class samples in the training data go to zero, and all the training data of the given class starts to give the exact same activations on the penultimate layer. They all collapse towards the class mean. And the class means collapse towards equal angles in the embedding space. They all have class mean vectors, all have equal angles between them. And that is kind of, and another thing which sort of directly follows from that is that if you put a linear classifier on top of the penultimate layer, uh, those linear classifier hyperplanes are dual to the class mean vectors. We'll show that graphically in a sec. And then basically the whole thing degenerates into a nearest class center classifier. So what that means is when anything comes in, you just, even if it's out of sample, you say, what does the nearest class mean? That's the class of the new thing. So graphically, here's what's going on, okay? So this is the data to start with before you've trained, before, when the network's initialized. And what we've got here is different colors. It's a little confusing. This individual training data samples map to these, this is like a two-dimensional embedding space. The individual samples map to these different blue dots, okay? And the different shades of blue correspond to different classes. You've got dark blue, medium blue, and light blue. It's confusing. They use shades for classes because they're using colors for something else. So the different shades of blue correspond to the different classes, and the class mean vectors are these blue vectors. Again, you've got dark blue, medium blue, and light blue. And those are the class mean vectors before we've done any training. And then we've got these green dots are just an equilateral triangle in the two-dimensional space. So the green spheres don't move as we go. So we go from, epoch 1 to like epoch 2 or epoch 200 or whatever it is, sometime later, you'll start to see the dark blue dots are all starting to converge. The light blue dots are all starting to converge. The medium blue dots are all starting to converge, and they're all starting to converge respectively to the class means, which are the blue vectors. And these red vectors are the dual vectors to the linear classifier, best linear classifier given the situation. And the green dots are again the equilateral triangle. And then after more training, the stuff gets even tighter. You'll notice all the dots are starting to converge towards the class means of their respective class, light blue, medium blue, or dark blue. And the class means are all starting to converge to the vertices of the equilateral triangle shown in green. And then when everything's done, you can't even see the little dots anymore because they're jammed inside these bigger spheres. And all the vectors have converged. The class means, the dual vectors to the hyperplane linear classifiers, and the vertices of the equilateral triangle. So class means converge to the vertices of the equilateral triangle in this case. And this is in a two-dimensional equiangular tight frame. And you can fit three classes in 2 dimensions and have all the vectors be equal angles to it. So here. Now, in higher dimensions, we have to remember what's going on with simplexes. So in 2 dimensions, a simplex is a triangle, and regular simplex is an equilateral triangle. In 3 dimensions, a simplex is a regular simplex is a tetrahedron, and a regular simplex is a regular tetrahedron. And again, if we look at the angles from the origin here in gray, oops, they're all equal. And then you can have higher dimensional simplexes, which we can try and draw, but it's harder to visualize. And then the Pascal triangle just shows us the number of topological entities, hypercells, vertices, edges, faces, hyperfaces, etc., in a simplex of n dimensions. So this stuff has been known for.
Creon, quick question.
Yeah.
What do you mean by simplex in this context?
A simplex is it is a shape defined by n points in n minus 1 dimensions. So 3 points in 2 dimensions, 4 points in 3 dimensions, etc., where the points are where they're all linearly independent. So that's a simplex. It's just n plus 1 points in n dimensions, where no vector is a linear combination of any others. And a regular one is where all the edges, angles, faces, hyperfaces are as regular as possible. And you can start to, you can draw them for 1, 2, and 3 dimensions. This is a tetrahedron, if you squint, a regular tetrahedron, if you squint at it correctly. And you can do it in higher and higher dimensions. Interestingly enough, the graph of a simplex is a complete graph where every vertex connects to every other. And of course, the angle between any two vertices is the same. And that's what they mean by an equiangular tight frame. Now, of course, these things in high dimensions, it doesn't look like the angles are the same because we're projecting it and trying to visualize in 2 dimensions. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the angles between all the vectors leading to the vertices of a simplex in higher and higher dimensions, what happens? Well, we know that in 2 dimensions, it's 120 degrees. And, in 3 dimensions, it's whatever the tetrahedral angle is, 12 degrees or something like that. But what's interesting is we go to higher and higher dimensions. Here, the number of dimensions is the x-axis. We go to higher and higher dimensions. The vertices of a simplex in high dimensions all end up at 90 degrees to one another. They all become orthogonal. So that's very interesting. Simplex in high dimensions has a bunch of vectors defining its vertices, and they're all orthogonal, which is hard to imagine because obviously in 2 dimensions, these vectors are not orthogonal to each other, but they get more and more orthogonal as you go to high dimensions. Mathematics tells me that.
Quick question, Creon.
Yeah.
What was the Slavic language class names in your previous? What are
I
these?
think these are just, this is like 1 point, one line, one line, blah, blah, blah.
Okay. Why is it in that Slavic language?
Because that was the best picture that I found, happened to be Polish. Okay. All right, so getting back to the neural collapse is the preferred end state of every successful exercise in feature engineering, because the simplex equiangular tight frame is the unique optimal codebook for a C-class linear decoding in the C-1 dimensional affine space. So that's a fancy way of saying that if you're trying to do C classes in C-1 dimensions, the equiangular tight frame gives you the optimal margin and separability between classes and the least chance of any sort of errors in classification. And let's see, here is they're just watching. There's a whole bunch of different data sets. The data sets are the columns. The rows are the network architectures. They do different network architectures, and 3 architectures on 6 data sets, and they're watching the various quantities come down, and the red lines are when the training error goes to 0. And what you'll notice is that it's just a generic phenomenon. Even though the training error goes to 0, in this case, the class means all have equal length, which is necessary for simplex. The classifier all end up, their angles become equal as you continue to drive the loss lower and lower. The angles all get to be what you want. The within class variation collapses, again, for the training data. All these things continue on approaching the equal angular tight frame, approaching neural collapse. All these different measures of neural collapse continue on after the red lines, where the training error is 0. And it happens no matter what network you're using and no matter what data set you're training on. And this is the adversarial robustness, which you want to go up. So this is a very interesting plot on the lower right, showing that for all these different architectures and all these different data sets, the robustness against adversarial examples continues to grow after the red line place where the training error has been driven to 0. Yes, Mikhail?
You mentioned earlier that these have to be over-parameterized neural networks for this to occur. Is there a sense of like how big the neural network needs to be, how many parameters for this type of phenomenon to arise?
No, I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. I mean, that has to do with what's going on in the hidden layers, which is, a much newer field of inquiry and much less is known. But, these networks, like even these smaller ResNets and stuff like that, like, if you're like, even what are some of these, like sidecar 100, right? That only has 100 classes, and damn well that network has way more than 100 parameters, right? So
Yeah.
The point is the networks tend to have more parameters than classes, for sure. Now, do they have more parameters than the possible values of like the possible images that you can input to them? No, they don't, because the number of possible images you can input into one of these classifiers, even if they're little bitty tiles, like 200 pixels on a side, that's like 10 to the 200th possibilities, and they certainly don't have that. So that's something to be said about that. Brad, yes?
Oh yeah, I just have a question about the adversarial robustness. Is
Mhm.
this like that classic sort of Ian Goodfellow mess with the input a little bit, and you can trick the
I don't know exactly how they I think with this case, with the adversarial robustness, they were probably just mixing noise into the images in different amounts, but I don't exactly know what their metric for adversarial robustness was. But
It's
one of the common ones is to just mix in noise and see, when your classification performance goes to hell. And what
I
they
see. I see.
and you can mix in more and more noise and get a constant low error, if you're willing to like overtrain on the
Right.
training. Okay. So now we get into, so this became known around 2020, and some additional people studied it. But one thing that happened is that there's this problem which is called catastrophic forgetting. Okay. And this has been known in AI for a long time. Oh, Ash, yeah, you have a question?
Oh, yeah. I was just wondering if you have any sense of if this happens with self-supervised learning in addition to like limited supervised with a set of
Yeah, the short
classes.
answer is yes, it does. It happens for almost anything. That's the beauty of it. This happens almost no matter what you're doing, no matter what the problem is, no matter what the architecture is, no matter what the initialization is, no matter what the loss function is, no matter what the training data is. If it's a big enough network on a big enough set of training data, like it's got to be, the training data has to be like well representative. You can't give it, shit training data and expect good results. But no, this is a universal phenomenon across all kinds of different different supervision methods and different downstream tasks. This is why it's also very related to transfer learning and few-shot learning. It all ties together. So the point is, what they're saying is that we want to get the advantages of this neural collapse, but we want to have some robustness against, we want to be able to add new classes and not have the whole thing fall apart. And so rather than read a bunch of text here, let's just look at in pictures. So you might say that at the beginning, you train a classifier for 3 classes: dogs, fish, and birds. Okay. And these class means, as well as all the training data, are going to collapse to these points in a equilateral triangle to all the extensions to hierarchy. Now, the problem is, if you introduce a new class, what is this? Food. It's a hot dog, right? You introduce a new class, food. Now it's like you retrain. It's like it all of a sudden gets terrible. Why? Because it's got to move. All these classes have to migrate to a new location so that now you've got 4 vectors that are approximately as close as you can get to equiangular spacing, which means all the previous class maps that you learned have to shift. That's what these black arrows are. And that's called catastrophic forgetting, because it's like all of a sudden it gets bad at the tasks it was good at just because you're trying to ask it to do one new thing, like classify food as a separate class. So what these guys are basically saying is, no, the thing to do, oh, and here they added yet another class, and it all forgets again, and everything's got to move around. These black arrows, they added boats, okay? So what they're saying here is, let's just say, even though you're training it on 3 classes, that you're going to eventually want to show it, say, 6 or some larger number of classes. So what you do is you make a loss function that forces any class to go to a predefined set of vectors, which are as equiangular as possible, so that you train it on the 3 classes, you get them here, and then when you add the new class, that just slots into this sort of, that's a slot you've reserved in one of these nice geometries. And eventually you can pack in 6 classes here, but then, you can't add another one. You have to sort of decide in advance how many classes maximum you're going to want it to be able to identify, even if you don't have training data initially for all those classes. Okay. Let's see. Oh, that's let's see. These are just some other pictures of this going on. Oh, but a very interesting thing happens, it turns out, when you have, we're going to talk more about this, when you have more classes than you can possibly put in equiangular vectors. So notice that if we have, say, 4 classes, automobiles, cats, dogs, and trucks, and we're going to need 4 vectors in 2 dimensions, they can't all be the same angle from each other. Some of them are 90 degrees and some of them are 180 degrees. But what happens, very interestingly, is when you train these classifiers through the terminal phase, double descent phase, not only do they get kind of as close as they can to being equiangular, which in this case it's on the vertices of a square, it's interesting, but like notice that automobiles and trucks, green and blue, are at 90 degrees, and cats and dogs are at 90 degrees, but like cats are 180 degrees away from truck. So it seems to somehow put related classes at nearer angles if it can't put everybody at the same angle to everybody else. Interestingly enough, it squeezes things so that related classes are at closer angles than distantly related classes. There's like a class hierarchy. It's like you could make a plane in here that separates vehicles. This plane that my cursor's sweeping out here would separate vehicles from animals. And it's not like you told it to do this. It's not like you trained it with superclass information. It's kind of magical. They sort of figured this stuff out. And here they're showing it with 6 classes. And again, they can't all, with 6 in 2 dimensions, they can't all be at equal angles, but they nonetheless seem to cluster with, what have we got? I guess horses should be somewhere between dogs and trucks. Let's see if that's true. Purple should be between red and black. Purple is indeed between red and black. So isn't that interesting?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So I'm familiar with double descent and catastrophic forgetting. What is neural forgetting, or the phrase you're using?
Neural collapse.
Neural collapse. Yeah. Or maybe you'll explain that. But what is that?
Well, neural collapse can pretty much explain double descent. Catastrophic forgetting is more like a problem that you'll have with any system if you don't allocate space for classes that you haven't seen yet. And neural collapse gives you a principled way to allocate that space.
Is this essentially what you're explaining here? So neural collapse is the process of this. You didn't use the term, but a kind of orthogonality between
Equiangular.
using equiangular instead. Okay.
Equal, but don't forget, equiangular means get the different directions as far apart as they can be. Well, if you have fewer classes than you do dimensions,
Yeah.
actually, if you have fewer classes than n-1 dimensions,
Right.
then they go to a simplex because that's totally equiangular. Everyone has the equal angle from everyone else. If you don't have enough dimensions, so they have one dimension for each class, now you can't quite get equiangular. But there's this tied with this interesting thing that as you go to high dimensions, equiangular simplexes become all vectors orthogonal. But let's go on. So like in this picture here, this is like where we've got a lot more classes than 2, which is the dimensionality of our embedding space. But if we do the terminal phase of training, what we find, let's just look at this figure B here, is that all the samples collapse down to the class means. They're not fully done collapsing here. And the class means are spread out as nicely as they can be. And this is true, of course, if you use an angular loss function, but it's true in general if you use more general, variety of loss functions. And again, they're showing it on, forget the WD guys, just look at B and D here. Like they can do it, you do it on different data sets with different architectures, and you end up spreading out your points optimally in angle. Now, this, of course, translates to higher dimensional spheres. We don't usually put stuff into a 2-dimensional embedding space. This is just for purposes of graphical illustration. As you remember, in previous lecture, I talked about spherical codes. There's a whole science that's been going on for 100 years in spherical codes. It's relevant to everything from crystallography to RF communications to fundamental physics to information theory to deep learning. So spherical codes in 3 dimensions, you can ask, how would we populate? Oh, wait a second. Let me actually bring this up in mathematics because that's going to be fun. Just a sec here. It's just somewhere, yeah. So here's Mathematica, right? And here's my little spherical code visualizer thingy. And so if I say, how would we put 2 points on a sphere so they're maximally separated? The sphere is blue. The 2 points are the 2 points are the pink spheres. They're at antipodes. If we're going to go 3 points, they're on an equilateral triangle. If we're going to go 4 points, what's the optimals? Oh, wait, that wasn't what I wanted. But you can sort of see what's happening. Stop that. 4 points, you get a tetrahedron. That's the simplex. Now, and everyone's equiangular still, just like they were with 3 points and 2 points. But once you go to more points, like 5, now they're no longer equiangular. You can see this exactly, but it's a 5 points is a triangular.
So they're no longer equiangular because that's in 3D, but in 5-dimensional space they'd be equiangular, right?
In 4-dimensional space.
In 4-dimensional space,
they'd be on the vertices of a simplex. 6 points, you have an octahedron. 7, 8. 8 points, interestingly enough, you might think be on the vertices of a cube, but they're not. They're on the vertices of a square antiprism. As you can see here, it's like a cube with its 2 faces rotated by 45 degrees. Anyway, that's just kind of fun. And as you go to higher, oops, wrong slider. As you go to higher and higher number of points, eventually Mathematica doesn't know the answer, so it just uses a little energy minimization. So this probably isn't the totally optimal spherical code for 115 points. But anyway, fair enough, whatever. It's just, this isn't 3D. I can't do it in 4D in Mathematica and make pictures of it. I'm not good enough. But back to our presentation. So here's a bunch of optimal codes in 3D for different numbers of spheres or numbers of classes, if you will, in a 3-dimensional embedding space. Now, interesting, if you look, there are exact results known for spherical codes. And this is this is there's what we were just looking at in 3 dimensions, what's the minimal angle between any two vectors? And of course, as you add more and more and more points, the cosine of the minimal angle goes to 1 because eventually they all get too crowded. But as you add more dimensions, the minimal angle gets bigger. So let's say for 18 points, in 3D, this is the minimal angle in 4D and 5D and 6D, and et cetera. The cosine of the angle approaches 0. So in high dimensions, you can always get everybody, orthogonal. Interestingly enough, there are certain strange dimensions, like 9 and 13 dimensions, where things go really flat for a long time. You can keep adding more points. Say 9 dimensions, you can add 27, 28, 29, 30, 32 points, and the minimal angle doesn't get any worse. They're not getting any more crowded. And there's these big circles. There's a few big circles here and there. These are the ones where it's mathematically proved what's optimal. 24 dimensions is a very special one, dimensionality. 24 points, and also 24 dimensions. Interesting. So spherical codes, people have done a lot of work on this. Now, this is not all that germane. All these details isn't germane, but I just want to say that, as you might guess, as you go to higher and higher dimensions, you can cram a lot of different clusters or points on the surface of a sphere that have good, a hypersphere that have good separation. And why do we care? Because this is sort of illustrative, right? If we have good localization of given class to a little near a vector on the hypersphere, and if the vectors are uniformly far apart, then we can just make a linear classifier shown with these blue planes that perfectly well separates these out. Obviously, if these clusters are too close together, it's much harder to make a linear classifier that separates them out. So this has to do with the neural collapse phenomenon. It drives them to these equiangular points as best it can, and then the linear classifier, kind of dual to the class mean vector, can separate out these guys. This is why we're not going to need fancy classifiers on top of stuff, Brad. Linear classifiers will do just fine. We get our representations correct.
Wait. Yes. No, you're right. But that assumes, I want to touch on that. If we had a fine-tuned clip model or an embedding model that was really well tailored for what we want.
Yes,
right.
yes. And don't get ahead of your skis here.
Yeah.
It's not clear that you need something that's so fine-tuned on the problem at hand. If it's trained on enough data, then transfer learning, as well as the neural collapse insights, let you see that if you need to do fine-tuning, you don't need to do much, because the point is these high-dimensional spaces have so many corners, if you will.
Yeah.
That, like, this is why you can train on ImageNet and run on satellite data, and it's not so bad, right? Anyway, that's a topic for a little later.
Yeah, I know. I'm interested
to do this because I only have 20 minutes left. So, but the question is, do you want to go all the way to the fully collapsed situation? And do they actually really collapse? So now people have started to look at this, okay? And it's like, do we want things in the same class to all map to the exact same vector in embedding space? So here we see an interesting experiment they did. They took CIFAR 10, which is the handwritten digits 0 through 9, that classic data set. And they grouped
CIFAR 10, you're talking an MNIST 0 to 9.
Oh, sorry. They did CIFAR 10, which is 10 image classes, right? And then they artificially made it from 10 classes to 5 classes. They took pairs of classes and called them the same class. So instead of 10 classes, they have 5 classes where each of the classes, like the purple one, consists of 2 of the original classes. But you don't train the network to know about the 2 original classes. You just train it to get this superclass correct. But what happens is, when you zoom in on this superclass, you find, again, I've alluded to this before, you find that it actually has separated the 2 subclasses, even though you didn't train it to do so. So this is pretty interesting. Now, obviously, if you drove it all the way to total collapse, these would all map to the same point, and there'd be no difference between the blue and the orange subclasses. But the point is, if you stop a little way before you're totally collapsed, then it maintains information about the semantic differences between, say, the images that you didn't even train it on. This is not all that well-known why, but I'm going to go to a figure that some of you may remember, because I think that this is sort of for some of the stuff we were looking at with our data. So here is the way of thinking about what's going on. If we're training, let's look at the black vectors only. We're training to recognize dogs, and they all map to this, the different dogs map to this spray of black vectors, and cats are going to map to somewhere else, and trucks are going to map to somewhere else on this sphere. But if we don't go all the way to collapse, so that the different dogs actually go to different points on a small, tiny patch of the hypersphere. And now, so Mikhail, you'll like this because it's like the cloud vector stuff. If we project out the dog versus cat versus truck dimension, which I show by projecting down, projecting out the common dog vector component, now we get these red vectors. And they're in one dimension lower, which happens to be on this disk, right? And now we can normalize those. So now they're on a hypersphere of one fewer dimensions, with the blue circle. And now what we find is like the Chihuahuas are going to be over here, and the Great Danes are going to be over here. Those were like the little residuals that were left before we totally collapsed all the dogs into the same vector. And so I think this is very powerful, and so do other people. And so this is leading now, this pretty new stuff. People are talking about like a view of training which is on multiple hyperspheres that are really just sub-hyperspheres of a higher dimensional hypersphere. And that's kind of what they're showing here. It's sort of like a higher dimensional cartoon of what I was just showing, where, you know, you train all the dogs and they go in this blue direction, but there's a little spread as shown by these green vectors. And then if you look at where they land on this lower dimensional hypersphere, you can now distinguish between one type of dog and another type of dog, one type of cat and another type of cat. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, this leads us to say, what is actually going on in these embedding spaces? Like, how are concepts represented? And now we can switch into language models. And as you know, language models also, I skipped a slide, but you know that all these models have embedding layer in the bottleneck somewhere in the middle of them, or near the end of them. Anyway, even language models put stuff into an embedding space. And that's kind of where, what they use as internal representation. And so here what we see is something very interesting, which is that, let's see, look at this statement. Simple categorical complex concepts are represented as simplices, and complex concepts are represented as polytopes. What does that mean? It's kind of like what I was showing before. We've got the animals vector, and now we've got the mammals, the fish, and the birds. And the mammals, fish, and birds lie on the vertices of a polytope, in this case a triangle, that is normal, orthogonal to the generic animal direction. And here we have another example. We have mammals, we add a fourth class, and now they're lying on the vertices of tetrahedron. And it's the four-dimensional situation, like the generic animal class kind of maps us to the middle of the tetrahedron. And then the specific animal subclasses map to the vertices of the tetrahedron. And these nested polytopes appear to be living inside of language models. This is not image data. This is language data, okay? This is word to vec kind of stuff, or, I don't even remember what it was that they used. But these are tokens that they got out of ChatGPT-4. These are the embeddings of the tokens coming out of ChatGPT-4 that correspond to different birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles, and they lie on the vertices of this simplex. So isn't that interesting? And now we're going to look at one or two last little things and then wrap it all up. We're going to look at all the stuff about neural collapse is kind of about the kind of last layer in classifiers, last embedding and language model. It's looking at the kind of penultimate or ultimate embedding after all the hidden layers are done. So what's going on in the hidden layers? Well, it turns out that collapse is going on in the hidden layers too. So that, like, let's just take one example here. Let's look at this one. This is an 8-layer network, and it's we're looking at the training accuracy here, and we're looking at how much accuracy we can get if we kind of cut off some of the layers. So it may be an 8-layer network here, but let's say we cut off at, what is this, layer 4. Layer 4, if we just use layer 4's outputs and try and, do a softmax and figure out which class it is, we do better than if we just cut it off at layer 3. So if we cut it off at layer 1, it's no good, and layer 2 is a little better, and layer 3 is a little better, and layer 4 is a little better, and the higher numbered layers, they improve longer. But they seem to like this, they all kind of smash together here, which makes you think some of the highest layers aren't really doing very much. Same with the test data. Obviously, going from 1 layer to 2 layer to 3 layers to 4 layers is giving you more and more accuracy. But 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there's no difference. So this suggests that collapse is happening in different layers, and eventually you've kind of extracted the low-dimensional semantics from your data, and adding more layers, isn't going to make things any better. And they've tried this for a bunch of different networks and a bunch of different layers and a bunch of different data sets. And this seems to be an interesting phenomenon, that there is a natural depth, or at least for a given problem. And going beyond that depth doesn't improve things. This is another example of the same thing. They're looking at error rate if you just cut the network off at different layers. And oh no, this is looking at the neural collapse. This is looking explicitly for neural collapse in different layers and showing that it's going on at all layers. Each of these layers is mapping stuff down pretty closely to an equiangular tight frame, or at least an optimal spherical code, if there's not enough dimensions for an equiangular tight frame. And okay, we're almost done here. So now, again, they're looking at the different layers. So you take the output of a given layer and you put it through, what is this, a UMAP or something like that. And after training the first layer, there's not much class separation. Looking at a UMAP colored by class. The second layer, we start to see, like, the orange guys are now concentrated in 3 places. And now after layer 4, it's too bad they don't show layer 3, the orange guys are all mapped into one tight little blob. And here's a different architecture. Same thing. The different layers are slowly collapsing the classes down to essentially equal angular tight frame, if they can get away with it. But there's an interesting thing going on. Notice this. They're talking about other work. They both demonstrated that the dimension of the intermediate features first blows up and later goes down from shallow to deep layers. And this is something that took me a while to figure out. But I'm going to go back to this picture, which I should have shown at the beginning, and which I've shown in a number of other lectures. This is 4 different architectures: ResNet, UNet, autoencoder, and simplified transformer. Now, I used to show this because I wanted to show, see the red dotted box. This is the embedding we mentioned. This is the reduction to the embedding space. It all goes through these layers and goes down to this embedding space. In this case, it's 4,000 dimensions. In the UNet, you can see sneaked in here at the bottom, there's an embedding space of 1,024 dimensions. It's kind of the bottleneck, right? Autoencoder obviously takes this thing, goes down to an embedding space of much lower dimensionality. Let's ignore the decoder part. And even in the transformers, inside each transformer stage, there is a linear embedding space. Now, these, but however, these are lies, these diagrams. They are not telling the truth. They make it look like the dimensionality is getting smaller and smaller and smaller because you look at the size of these boxes. But what you got to realize is, no, you may be going down from 160 by 160, like first you are 160 by 160 by 3. Then you jump up to 160 by 160 by 64. That's much higher number of dimensions and parameters. Then you go to 80 by 80 by 128, which is about the same. 20 by 20 by 512. I mean, the dimensionality gets larger before it gets smaller in terms of each of these layers. And the same with, the autoencoder. Like, you may go down from 256 squared to 128 squared, but you're going up from like 3 channels to 4 channels, and you're going up to 64 layers of 128 squared, or 64 parallel convolutions, right? It's like 128 by 128 by 64 is a lot more than 256 by 256. So actually, in spite of the fact that these things look like they're getting smaller, I think sort of being truthful here, the volume of these blocks in terms of the number of parameters or the dimensionality of the space, or however you want to look at it, is getting larger and larger. And then eventually it gets smaller down in the bottleneck. So what's going on here is that you first expand the dimensionality of the space, and then you compress it down again to much smaller than the original. Why do you expand it? You expand it because the semantic content, whether it's language, images, whatever, is a highly convoluted nonlinear relationship. Images, like there's all kinds of things going on at all different scales relating directionality, size, shape, texture. It's a highly convoluted nonlinear situation in terms of looking at the pixels. If you expand the dimensionality, you can trade dimensions for nonlinearity. You can get rid of all the nonlinear difficult stuff and replace it with linear stuff in higher dimensions. And the classic example of this, known before deep learning, is the kernel trick. We're trying to make a classifier that separates the red points from the blue points. A linear classifier, we can't do it in 2 dimensions. There's no line we can draw that separates the red points from the blue points. No straight line, no linear boundary between these 2 classes. But if we expand up to 3 dimensions, and instead of just looking at x and y, we look x and y and z, where z is, say, the sum of x squared plus y squared. Now all of a sudden we can fit a linear classifier that perfectly separates the 2 classes. And you can do this with other shapes. A complicated XOR problem with red and blue points. There's no linear boundary that separates the red points from the blue points. But if we expand into a higher dimensional space with nonlinear terms, now all of a sudden we can fit a linear classifier. This is like a saddle. I wish I could rotate this. I should do this. And now let's look at ReLU and see what's going on, because our networks in general don't make polynomials and stuff like that, not directly, but they use ReLUs. Now we all know what ReLU looks like. It is a nonlinear activation function. But don't forget that the ReLUs are not usually 1D like this. They're usually taking weighted sums of multiple inputs. So here's a ReLU in pink in 2 dimensions. Now a ReLU in pink, it can separate these orange points from these red points. 2-dimensional ReLU, because these are linearly separable. But let's say we had a situation like we did before with we're trying to separate the red points from the blue points. We're trying to use ReLU. Well, an individual ReLU, depending on its coefficients, is just going to give us like a hinge, like it's going to separate the red region from the white region. It's not going to do the job, even if we monkey around with the coefficients. We're just rotating it, right? And if we monkey around with the biases, we're just shifting it, right? We're just moving it parallel to itself. So if we monkey with the biases on a ReLU, we still can't do it. Like here's ReLU with different biases. None of them are going to separate the red points from the blue points. However, if we take one ReLU and another ReLU and a third ReLU, and we add them together, which we do with network with multiple neurons, now all of a sudden when you add them together, you get a nice a reasonably nice thing that can separate the red points from the blue points. So this is one of the reasons why ReLU and other nonlinear functions work. But if you think about it, what we're doing is we're using a bunch of ReLUs, which in this case is like 6-dimensional space. We've got three ReLUs, each with 2 weights and a bias, so we're 9 dimensions. And if we're using 9 dimensions, we can kind of get this. We can trade 9 linear dimensions and now get generality in 2 dimensions where we have nonlinear class boundaries. And here we see it again. Here's adding more and more ReLUs. This coloration is stupid, but we're trying to separate the blue points from the orange points, and we add more and more ReLUs, and eventually, when we add enough, we get a nice separator made of 50 ReLUs that separates the blue from the orange. We could use tanh, which is another nonlinear activation function. It kind of makes a smoother boundary, but it's the same thing. One doesn't do it. 10, you'd think would do a better job than this, but apparently not in this network. But eventually, do it. Now, with linear activations alone, you just can't do it because you can sum as many linear activations as you want and you just get another. And here's the classic whatever the spiral 2 spirals data set, and if you use a bunch of ReLUs, they don't say how many here, eventually enough ReLUs can kind of chop out the spirals and separate them from one another. Again, you're trading dimensions against nonlinearity. So we have a nonlinear thing in 2 dimensions. We loft it up. It's a bunch of linear things in, whatever, 50 dimensions. And then we can compress it back down again. And so that's what happens in these networks. They go to higher dimensions and separate things out. And then once they got them separated, they can compress them down, put each class at the vertex of a low enough dimensional simplex or spherical code that it actually captures the thing. But you have to first disentangle it. It's just like doing math. You write out the expressions and you expand and expand and expand, and then you start canceling terms and compressing it back down, and hopefully you get a nice answer. Or the same with code, right? That's what refactoring means, right? It's gotten all complicated, but it had to in order to do what we want. And then once it's complicated, and we kind of figure out how to compress it and make it simple again. Okay. Last penultimate topic here. Sorry, I'm a little over. What is the relationship of neural collapse to CLIP and contrastive learning? That's of special interest to us, the planet. There's a couple papers on this, not very many. 2023 is this one, and it's just interesting statements here. Neural collapse optimality of text-to-image representation shows a positive correlation with downstream generalizability. Okay, so they're proposing to combine neural collapse with CLIP, and then they do it, and they do a very interesting thing here because can't go too far into CLIP here, but remember, one of the weird things about CLIP is that although it maps images and text, similar images, like it maps images and their captions to similar places in the vector space. But it turns out those places aren't really all that similar. They have some interesting relationships to one another, but there's actually a pretty big distance between images and text in the shared vector space of the CLIP model. And it still works pretty well. But what these guys do is they say, no, we're going to force the images and the text and the corresponding text to map to the same vectors. And we're going to drive those vectors using prompt tuning. Actually, and they're doing this on a satellite image data set, interestingly enough. We're going to drive those vectors to neural collapse, particularly by adding extra tokens and tuning the text prompts with extra tokens. We're going to fine tune this CLIP model. It actually goes beyond CLIP. They call it Maple, and then they change it even more. What is NPT? There's something prompt tuning, neural collapse prompt tuning. They force, using prompt tuning, the linguistic vectors to go into these optimal spherical codes, whether they call them that or not. And they get much better performance out of these CLIP models after they do that. So they're using neural collapse to guide the prompt tuning. I don't mean prompting like super prompting. I mean, prompt tuning, which we haven't really talked about a lot, but it's a mathematical thing that involves numbers at prompts, extra dimensions. And they force the language tokens to collapse onto these equiangular vectors, and the whole contrastive learning thing starts to behave much better. They're actually forcing here, they're trying to show it like you've got text features and they're not equiangular, and they force the text features to be equiangular. They're trying to show that here. And then they get the image features corresponding to also be equiangular, and they get all this stuff to line up, and they get much better performance. A better neural collapse phenomenon of text to image representations indicates a better generalizability on prompt tuned clip. Better generalizability. This is kind of, the holy grail for both networks and for understanding. Like, what is generalizability? And by the way, in this one, you can see they've frozen everything. They've frozen the image encoder. They've frozen the text encoder. All they're doing is tuning the text prompts here. They don't even say, it's even optional to tune the visual prompts. You tune the text prompts with some extra numbers attached to them to force not just the normal clip loss to be lower, but they have this additional loss, which is having to do with, is it collapsed, and are these collapses the same between the image domain and the text domain? So they're trying to get everything to be equiangular, and they're trying to get the text stuff to line up, be the same as the image stuff. And by incorporating these additional loss functions and just tuning the prompts, they can make a clip network that is much better at generalization. I'm not going to go through this because we've gone long enough. Let's jump. But this is, let's just say this. These also guys are looking at neural collapse in the different layers and in the different, with the bottleneck formulation, which you may have heard of. But the important thing is this great yellow statement here that I have. Different models of the same architecture trained with contrastive loss are linearly identifiable. Their representations are equivalent only up to a trivial matrix transformation. What that means is if you train a network, in this case, using contrastive loss on a task, and then you reinitialize it and train it again, or you train a different network with the same dimensionality of embedding space, they will converge. They'll have neural collapse, and they'll converge down to these optimal spherical codes. And these codes are rigidly transformable one into the other. It's just a simple affine transformation. So these networks are all converging to the same underlying encoding. Now, Luke is laughing, but you're going to really laugh at this. So this all kind of goes into this paper called the Platonic representation hypothesis, a fairly new paper, May 24. And they say every sufficiently big network is converging to the same model, is converging to the same representation. No matter what the network, and we saw this with Brace-Mignard also to some extent. It doesn't matter what you train it on. It doesn't matter how you initialize it. It doesn't matter what loss function you use. It doesn't matter what job you're even asking it to do. As long as you're training it on enough stuff and asking it to do a hard enough job, they all converge. It doesn't, or how many neurons, how wide it is, how deep it is, what the activation functions are. It's like they all pretty much converge to the same underlying representation. And you can tell it's the same because you can actually train different ones and then try and find a map that rotates one representation into the other representation. And damn, you can do it. And,
Creon,
yeah.
that's a very strong claim. Can you show specifically the data set and results where they show that?
Here, like he's my what do they call that? My straight man. Anyway, so here is 78 different vision models trained, trained 78 different vision models. And what's interesting is they're colored by how good they are at solving this whole set of different benchmark tasks for vision models. So the ones that are not good at solving them are the red ones of the 78 models, and the ones that are good at solving a whole bunch of different vision problems are the blue ones. And then this is a UMAP embedding of the models of the differences. It's a UMAP embedding of the differences between the models. And what that means is you look at how each model transforms a whole bunch of different input images, where it goes into embedding space. And then you try and make you try and do a rigid alignment of one to the other. And you find out how closely aligned they are to each other. So the point is that the ones which perform well end up much more closely aligned to each other, up to a rigid transformation in terms of their mapping of images to embedding vectors. And the ones which are not good have much bigger distance once you've aligned them as well as you can.
Creon, unfortunately, I'm starting to cook dinner for my family, so there's some noise. I just want to mention I'm somewhat uncomfortable with these results because if you look empirically at, let's say, large language models, they seem to be literally encoding specific facts and details within them. And so it doesn't seem like every large language model, for example, is equivalent. And I don't know, this is a very strong claim that I think we have to be careful with. I think it's interesting, but it obviates the importance of data. Actually, it obviates the importance of data because
they trained 78 vision models and they got these results as well. They also, again, this is another chart. Here's the relative alignment of vision models, and the relative alignment goes way up as the models get better at performing more tasks.
So, so most of these tasks.
You said language, you said language models. Now they're also showing another thing. They're showing here that you can map language models to vision models with an alignment operation. After you've trained them, you can align the representations of different. You can just rigidly rotate one into the other, and it turns out that I guess here they're showing that bigger, richer language models align better with vision models, and on a couple of, and then they're showing as the alignment goes up, the performance goes up. As the alignment of the vision, of the language model to the vision model goes up, the performance goes up. Two different tasks. And
do you know, just really quick, I think, want to have a larger discussion on this one. It's very interesting. But I mean, if everyone trains on the same internet data and everyone evaluates themselves on the same common internet-centric data sets, then there'll be a convergence. But if you're doing some very specific thing like detecting geology or specific kinds of bespoke things, I don't understand how you magically have the Platonic ideal representation that data. I mean, certainly you can kind of be within the neighborhood and data can refine it.
Well, these are look, this is pretty new stuff. And this is, I agree that this isn't like rock solid. But let me just say that they have one more interesting. I want to point out another thing about this. So their hypothesis, right, is there's a reality, there's an underlying reality. And it doesn't matter whether you're understanding the reality through images and vision or through linguistic descriptions, that essentially once the models get big enough to really talk about a lot of reality, they're making a model of reality. And you can sort of see this with people, right? Like you could be blind and I could be deaf. But in some sense, if we're intelligent enough and knowledgeable enough, we're going to have very similar underlying models of reality, quite possibly. And so even though we're trained in completely different modes, we are kind of making a model of our realities, our shared realities that are similar in some ways. So again, language, vision, underlying reality. The idea is both of these systems, if they get big enough, the vision system or the language system, are converging to some approximation of the underlying reality. So that's kind of what they're showing here. They're saying, let's say you've got a you've got models with different capacities. They could be small capacities, two different models, or they could be large capacities, two different models, the different sorts of things they could represent. They're a large enough capacity model, no matter how it is trained or what its modalities are, has more chance of overlapping true reality, if you will, which is the star point here. So small models can't make it to the true optimum. Large models can make it to the true optimum, but the amount of space that the true optimum occupies compared to the whole space that the model can roam around in becomes a smaller and smaller proportion of the total model. So they have to converge to a very small, like, intersection on the Venn diagram. As is said here in the last thing this last slide, there are fewer representations that are competent for n tasks than there are for m less than n tasks. As we train more general models that solve more tasks at once, we should expect fewer possible solutions. So this is kind of,
I mean, it's incredibly fascinating, because if it is intercepting this kind of Platonic reality, as you mentioned, then it will be interesting with the interpretability research to also begin to sort of learn what it's learned to maybe discover things about reality.
Yep. Okay, so I'll just end it. This is just the first slide again, just because of recapitulation. We went terminal phase of training, neural collapse, equiangular tight frames and simplices, forgetting with additional classes, optimal spherical codes, which is the best you can do if you don't have enough dimensions to hold enough vectors in the simplex, in the vertices of simplex. There's this whole thing about, do we want to go all the way to collapse, or do we want to stop short of collapse so we still have variation within classes? And then there's neural collapse at different depth, what's going on inside the hidden layers. The whole relation to contrastive learning is not really all that hard to imagine, because if you're training with an angular loss function, then you're going to kind of obviously push to maximum margin under angular loss, which is going to be some kind of semi-regular distribution on the sphere that sort of maximizes the spacing as best you can between different vectors on the sphere. And then we ended with the Platonic representation hypothesis. So thanks. Sorry, I went a little over. Guess that was a lot of stuff.
This was super cool, Creon. Thanks for sharing this.
Yeah, so fascinating.
Okay, well,
it suggests that there's just some like deep reality or deep patterns that any sufficiently large, well-structured neural net will find.
yeah, if you have enough good quality training data on enough different things, it seems that may be true. And but it's more than that. In my mind, it's more than just that there's a model of reality. It's this really weird thing that you can kind of use, that these optimal spherical codes, if you're doing stuff on hyperspheres, if you're doing, angular loss or cosine similarity or whatever things, whatever name you choose, you're pushing things to equal distribution, as equal low energy distributions of electrons on the surface of a sphere, and it's like, gosh, is that what's going on? And because Brice Mignard, and I'm waiting for him to give his talk because he keeps saying he will, but now he's in China. But he's shown, which we didn't talk about here. Remember Brice, Jesse?
Yeah.
No, I'm asking Jesse. Yeah. So yeah, I've stayed in contact with him over the years, more than I have with you, Jesse, fortunately. And Brice has not only shown also that these things can be orthogonally rotated one network into another, depending on, almost no matter what you're doing, but he's shown that, oh shit, no, I forgot what he's shown. Oh yeah, he said that he showed me some slides, but I didn't copy them, unfortunately. Oh, they're probably sitting in Rewind somewhere, but I'm too lazy to look. But he 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 says that this is true with fMRI and human brain activity. That like if I go into an fMRI machine and do a task, I don't know, solving a puzzle or reading a poem or whatever it is, and you go into an fMRI machine and do the same task, we get these completely different activation patterns that are lighting up. However, you can find an orthogonal transformation, which maps my patterns to your patterns, which makes it's like just the same. Like spherical codes are rigid. Like you can rotate a spherical code and it's still a spherical code, even though all the coordinates of everything changes. So, so like maybe even in our brains, something like this is going on.
There's the data set from the, I think it's called iMind or MindEye or something like that did FRMI to clip and then to SDXL unclip.
Wait,
They have.
What do you mean they did it to clip?
So what they did is they had volunteers sitting in a fMRI seeing a new image every 2 seconds, and they were given a task to do. And basically, they were recording an fMRI of the visual section of the brain, and then they knew the image that was being displayed at the same time, and so they were capturing both of those. And then what they did is they have I think 40 hours or 8 hours per volunteer and 40 different volunteers. And so I'll share this paper later, but then what they've done is they can map from the FRMI back to what the clip embedding was of the image they were looking at. And so the original model was the version 2 of the paper, which was this year, was that they could actually do an adapter. So they actually have a generic model of FRMI, and then they only need an hour of new data for each new person. Now you're making a stronger claim that maybe it's just I'm not going to like a projection or a different rotation of the same data rather than just saying we only need a small adapter. Whereas I guess if an adapter is just a linear transformation, maybe it is just a rotation.
Yeah.
So maybe that is saying the same thing. I'll share that paper with you, Creon, and you can share it with the group.
Okay. Yeah. Lovely. That's super cool. Yeah. I mean, look, this is pretty exciting stuff, even if it's not all true. It's tantalizing. And it's kind of scary too, right? Like, because this implies that, well, you have to stick someone in an fMRI machine, which is kind of a hard thing to do in a stealthy way these days. But there's that. I think I might have sent this to you, Luke. That great excerpt from Daniel Suarez's book. Like I should post this for everybody. Maybe I'll send another invite that just has a link to the thing. It's not for a real invitation, but it's like Daniel Suarez wrote this section in one of his books where this is long before deep learning, where they stick some criminal in an
Daniel Suarez. Yes, I've read many of his science fiction books.
Yeah, so they stick a criminal in an fMRI machine, and they don't even know what language he speaks or anything about him, and this computer just zeroes in on who he is, where he's from, what he's doing, why he's here, what he did, what the nature of his crime was. He doesn't even say a word. It just asks him questions and shows him images, and eventually it completely figures out everything about him, and he's just like, okay, I want to join you guys. It's funny. Yeah. All right. Oh geez. We have
What is the practical impact of, let's say this is true, that every sufficiently complicated model trained on sufficiently large amount of data is just affine transformations. Their embeddings are just affine transformations of each other. What is the practical impact of that, let's say for us? Is it the fact
one impact is that in its most extreme form, and I know Brad is skeptical, it doesn't matter what model you use, it doesn't matter what architecture you use, it doesn't matter what you train it on, it doesn't matter what task you want it to do. Like all these models are converging to kind of the same, are different simple rotations of the same underlying model. And so there's one model to rule them all, and so that's interesting.
It's interesting to think of taking new data sets, like totally different like modalities, and converting them to formats that go into these networks, like a sensor not meant to make images, but we turn the data into an image and put it in and see, like,
Well, you
sometimes
don't
that's
even
difficult.
necessarily have to turn it into an image, right? Because I mean, the fact that transfer learning and few shot learning works at all is evidence that something like this is probably going on. The fact that you don't have to retrain a whole new deep foundation model.
Yeah, I guess you could just make an adapter that accepts that input and pushes it into the network.
I will say that the classic explanation of why ImageNet worked for fine tuning was that the lowest layers had learned convolutional kernels that were very common across problems, edge detectors, texture. So that was the classic explanation of ImageNet.
Well, but that was
Platonic.
never, here's the problem with that. I mean, that was plausible, except that I don't know that it was ever true that when people looked at the higher layers in these networks, or the middle layers, like, the bottom layers found edges and corners, and the top layers, cats and dogs, but the middle layers were like, they were just
they're super hard to understand, the middle layers.
Yeah, but I bet that if you cast them in terms of if you look at the middle layers output as a vector, and you look at how are the vectors for the different objects distributed in the vector space, you're going to find that they're like each layer's pushing it has a certain number of dimensions it's trying to either compress or expand to, and it's maximally separating as best it can into that number of dimensions.
Creon, I think in your investigations, I think you'll really enjoy what's happening in dictionary learning, in the interpretability world, of using sparse autoencoders to take an already trained network and force these orthogonal representations to sort of tease them out. I think it could play really interestingly into the stuff you've been looking at. It's really interesting stuff.
I don't know anything about dictionary learning, so thanks, I guess.
Yeah, so Anthropic is the one, they did this really big paper the last year, and then there's been some cool work on Clip I shared in the channel. But it's using sparse autoencoders.
By the way, let's not forget about this Clip model. Which one was it again? The one that they said where they super align it with the understanding. Yeah. Let's not forget about this one where they forced the neural collapse on Clip on a satellite data set and got all these neat results. That's from.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What was the satellite data set?
It's called
Eurosat.
Eurosat.
Oh, Eurosat. Yeah, that's a classification challenge, right? On Sentinel-2.
It's a land cover class.
It's land cover class. Yeah.
But the title of the paper is understanding. What is it called? Yeah, here it is. I'll post it in the chat. It's an interesting paper, but it's I'm more interested in a way for if we can just swipe their model and stick it into our thing and see how it works. Yeah, here it is in the chat.
I've had better results for earthbound things with Siglip as well. I don't know if you all have played with it.
I hear very good things about Siglip. It's just can't remember his name, Lucas or something. I've heard we just haven't had a Siglip variant that was trained on remote sensing imagery. Do you have are you just using Siglip out of the box?
Yeah, this is more for like helping replicate customers with things like photo apps and things like that, not cool space stuff anymore.
Given this talk, I wonder if we want to just start using those off-the-shelf models more without fine-tuning necessarily.
Yeah, by the way, this comes back to one of my original points, was that we have no validation data sets that are quantified. There's no way for us to directly test Siglip versus remote clip versus vanilla clip versus zig clip, whatever this is. So this stuff is so subjective, so vibes based.
Well, wait a minute. All these people, there are publications where they're comparing one CLIP-like model to another on remote sensing data. Like they surely
They,
can't.
they are, but I do want to mention, I do believe, sorry, I'm cooking at the same time. I do believe that Sentinel is really unique in the fact that it's spectral and radiometric. And we only have, it's really hard, I think, when I look at anything that has a Sentinel-2 data set on it, I get skeptical because it's different than our satellites, frankly. It has all this.
I don't know. Maybe you're right. We don't know. And you're right. We don't know partially because we don't have our own validation data.
If you've got shortwave, if you have SWIR, and I think that most of these Sentinel-2 embedding models and foundation models end up learning radiometric separation and less spatial. And I think it's opposite for our satellites.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting conjecture. I'll just leave it.
Yeah, no, it is. It's an intuition. It's a conjecture.
I mean, this is the problem I have. Brad. We have like these two camps. We have the camps. Brad is one. Brad is a member of this camp. EO Lab and Christopher Anderson are a member of this camp. Google is apparently a member of this camp, and they all are taught to train a foundation model on Planet data, which would be fine. I have nothing against doing that as long as Planet doesn't have to pay millions of dollars. And then we have these things I've been showing you where people are saying, it doesn't matter what you train it on. It doesn't matter what mode you use. It doesn't matter what architecture you use. If you have enough training data and you run it long enough, it comes up with a general model that can do almost anything. So it's like they both can't be right.